The carriage door slammed shut before Alara could take another breath of free air. She sat rigid on the cold leather seat, her hands clenched together in her lap, knuckles pale beneath her gloves. Outside the small window, the grey townhouses of London blurred past, each one grander than the last, each one bringing her closer to a man she had never met and already feared. Her mother had warned her only an hour before the ceremony. Keep your eyes low. Do not question him. Do not give him reason to raise his voice, for they say his temper has ended friendships and ruined men who dared to cross him. Alara had nodded then, though her stomach had twisted into a knot that had not loosened since. The Duke of Marchfield, Alaric Vane. A name spoken in London drawing rooms with a strange mixture of fear and fascination. Some claimed he had once dismissed an entire household staff in a single afternoon without explanation. Others whispered that he had broken off a betrothal so suddenly that the young lady in question left the city in shame and never returned. No one seemed to know the truth of him, only the shape of the fear he left behind. And now Alara was to be his wife. It was not a match born of love, or even simple affection. Her father had died 8 months earlier, leaving behind more debts than anyone in the family had known existed. The Whitmore name, once respected among the lesser gentry, had become a quiet embarrassment, whispered about at card tables and needlework circles alike. When the Duke's solicitor arrived at their modest home with an offer of marriage, Alara's mother had wept with relief before Alara had even finished reading the letter. There had been no courtship, no exchange of letters filled with careful affection, only a contract, signed by men in a room Alara was not permitted to enter, and a wedding date set with the same coldness one might use to schedule a business transaction. The carriage slowed, and Alara's heart climbed into her throat. She had married him only that morning, in a small chapel with more silence than celebration. He had said his vows in a low, even voice that gave nothing away. She had done the same, though her voice had trembled where his had not. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Alaric had not smiled. He had simply turned to her, studied her face for a moment too long to be comfortable, and then offered his arm to lead her from the chapel. Now she was to see his home, her home, she reminded herself, though the word felt foreign on her tongue. The carriage came to a stop, and a footman opened the door. Alara stepped down onto the stone drive, tilting her head back to take in the townhouse before her. It was enormous, built of pale gray stone, with tall windows that seemed to watch her like rows of unblinking eyes. Ivy climbed one corner of the building, the only softness in an otherwise imposing structure. Alaric was already waiting near the entrance, having ridden ahead on horseback rather than share the carriage with her. He was tall, with dark hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome, if not for the guarded stillness in his eyes. He wore black, as he had at the ceremony, and the color seemed to suit him too well, as though he had chosen it deliberately to match his reputation. "Welcome to Marchfield House," he said, his voice quiet and without warmth. "I trust the journey was tolerable." "It was, Your Grace," Alara answered, dropping into a small curtsy out of habit more than thought. Something flickered across his face, there and gone before she could name it. "You need not call me that within these walls," he said. "Alaric will do." She nodded, though she could not quite bring herself to use his given name aloud, not yet, not when everything about him still felt like a stranger wearing the shape of a husband. He led her inside, and the interior of the house was as grand and as cold as its exterior. Marble floors stretched beneath their feet, polished so fine that she could see her own pale reflection looking back up at her. Portraits lined the walls of the entrance hall, stern-faced men and women from generations past, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she walked. The staff had gathered to greet her, a long row of servants standing with practiced stillness. A woman introduced as the housekeeper, sharp-featured and silver-haired, offered a curtsy so brief it bordered on insolence. Alara caught the way the woman's eyes moved over her second-hand gown, taking in every seam and every sign of a family that had once had money and no longer did. "Mrs. Prescott will show you to your rooms," Alaric said, already turning away, his attention drawn elsewhere before Alara had finished absorbing the sight of her new home. "I have matters that require my attention this evening. We will dine together tomorrow." And with that, he was gone, disappearing down a corridor without another word, leaving Alara standing alone in the entrance hall of a house that did not yet feel like hers, surrounded by servants who did not yet trust her, married to a man who had spoken to her for less than a minute since their vows. Mrs. Prescott led her up a wide staircase, past more portraits, more silence, more grandeur that felt hollow rather than comforting. The housekeeper said little, offering only clipped directions and the occasional disapproving glance, as though Alara's very presence were an inconvenience to the household's routine. Her new chambers were beautiful, there was no denying that. A large bed with soft linens, tall windows overlooking a private garden, a writing desk of polished wood. But beauty alone could not chase away the unease that had settled into Alara's chest since the moment she had stepped into that carriage that morning. Alone at last, she sat by the window and watched the garden below, where a gardener trimmed hedges into careful shapes. Her mind wandered back to her old home, small and worn but filled with warmth, filled with the sound of her father's laughter before the debts had swallowed him whole, filled with the memory of a boy who used to chase her through the narrow hallway, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. Peter. The thought of her younger brother came unbidden, as it often did in quiet moments like this one. He would have been 16 years old now, had he lived long enough to grow, but Alara did not truly know if he had lived or died. She only knew that one autumn morning, when she was 12 years old, Peter had simply vanished from their home, and her father had refused to speak of it ever again. Debts, her mother had murmured once, late at night when she thought Alara was asleep. Your father owed a terrible debt, and the boy was the price of it. Alara had never learned more than that. She had grown into womanhood carrying the weight of an unanswered question, a wound that had never properly healed because she did not even know its full shape. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. A young maid entered, carrying fresh linens, her eyes darting nervously toward Alara, before dropping to the floor. "Beg pardon, my lady," the girl said. "I did not mean to disturb you." "You are not disturbing me," Alara said gently, offering the girl a small smile, the first genuine one she had managed all day. "What is your name?" The maid seemed startled by the question, as though few had ever bothered to ask. "Nora, my lady." "Thank you, Nora." The girl curtsied and moved to set down the linens, but as she did, Alara noticed something curious. Nora's eyes flicked toward a closed door at the end of the corridor, visible through Alara's own open doorway, and something like fear passed across her young face before she quickly looked away. "What is that room?" Alara asked, unable to stop herself. Nora's hands stilled on the linens. "I could not say, my lady." "You do not know?" "I know only that it is always locked," the maid said, her voice dropping lower, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "No one is permitted inside, not even Mrs. Prescott, as far as I have ever seen. His Grace keeps the key himself." A chill traced its way down Alara's spine, though she could not have said why. It was only a locked room, after all. Every great house had its private corners, its spaces kept closed for reasons that likely had nothing to do with her at all. And yet, later that evening, once Nora had gone and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Alara found herself unable to sleep. She rose from her bed and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, drawn by a curiosity she could not fully explain, and made her way quietly down the corridor. The locked door stood exactly where Nora had said it would, plain and unremarkable except for the heavy iron lock that gleamed faintly in the low light of the hall sconces. Alara pressed her palm gently against the wood, as though she might somehow sense what lay beyond it. A floorboard creaked behind her, and she spun around, her heart lurching into her throat. Alaric stood at the end of the corridor, still dressed as he had been that afternoon, his expression unreadable in the shadows. He must have only just returned from wherever his evening business had taken him. "You should be resting," he said, his voice carrying an edge she had not heard from him before. "I could not sleep," Alara answered, stepping back from the door as though caught in some wrongdoing, though she had done nothing more than stand near it. His gaze moved to the locked door behind her, and something shifted in his expression, something guarded and pained that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "That room is not to be entered," he said, "by anyone. I trust you will respect that." "Of course," she said quietly, though the mystery of it had only deepened in her mind. He said nothing further. He simply turned and walked toward his own chambers, leaving Alara standing alone once more in the dim corridor, staring at a locked door that seemed to hold more of her husband's secrets than his own quiet words ever could. She returned to her room, but sleep did not come easily. She lay awake for a long while, thinking of the cold stranger she had married, the hidden room he guarded so fiercely, and the brother she had lost so long ago, wondering, in the fragile hours before dawn, whether either mystery would ever find its answer. At some point in the night, exhaustion finally overcame her worry, and she drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. She dreamed of the old house where she had grown up, of narrow hallways and the sound of small feet running ahead of her, laughter echoing off walls that no longer existed. In the dream, she reached out to catch the boy who ran from her, but her fingers closed on nothing but air, and she woke with a start just as the first gray light of morning touched the edges of her window. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the quiet of the great house settling around her. the distant sound of servants beginning their duties somewhere below. It struck her then how strange it was to wake in a bed that was not her own, in a house filled with strangers, bound by law to a man whose face she could still barely picture clearly when she closed her eyes. Ilara rose and dressed with Nora's help, choosing her plainest gown, unwilling to draw further attention to herself before she understood the rules of this new world she had entered. As she sat before the small mirror while Nora arranged her hair, she caught sight of her own reflection and hardly recognized the pale, uncertain woman staring back at her. "You seem troubled, my lady," Nora said softly, her hands pausing in their work. "I am only tired," Ilara replied, though the words felt thin even to her own ears. Nora hesitated, glancing toward the door as though to be certain they were alone. "His Grace is not an easy man to know," she said quietly, "but I have served in this house 3 years now, and I have never once seen him raise a hand or a voice to any soul beneath this roof, whatever the town may say of him." The words offered small comfort, yet Ilara found herself holding on to them regardless, turning them over in her mind as she made her way down to breakfast alone, since Alaric had already left the house before she had even risen. The empty seat across the table felt like its own kind of message, and Ilara ate in silence, surrounded by grandeur that did nothing to ease the loneliness settling deep in her chest. The first month at Marchfield House passed like a slow, careful dance between two people who did not yet know each other's steps. Ilara learned quickly that Alaric was a man of routine, rising early, disappearing for hours into his study or riding out across the estate grounds, returning only for dinner, which they took together each evening in a dining room so large that their 2 chairs seemed like distant islands, separated by a sea of polished mahogany table. Their conversations during those meals were brief, polite, and careful, skimming only the surface of safe topics. The weather, the estate, the occasional mention of a letter from a distant relation. Never once did he ask her about her family, and never once did she ask him about the locked room at the end of the corridor, though it remained fixed in her thoughts more often than she cared to admit. The household staff remained cautious around her, though Ilara noticed small changes as the days passed. Nora grew warmer, offering little smiles during their morning routines, sometimes lingering a moment longer than necessary to share some small piece of gossip about the neighboring estates. Mrs. Prescott remained cool, but even she had begun to nod in greeting, rather than simply looking through Ilara, as though she were made of glass. It was during her long, quiet afternoons, when Alaric was occupied elsewhere and the house felt too vast and too silent, that Ilara's mind wandered most often to the past. She had been 12 years old the autumn her brother disappeared. Peter had been only 8 then, a bright, curious boy who followed her everywhere, who begged her to read to him each night before bed, who filled the house with a kind of noise that Ilara had not realized she missed until it was gone. She remembered the morning clearly, sharper than she wished it could be. She had woken to find her mother crying softly in the kitchen, her father locked away in his study with the door bolted from the inside, and Peter's small bed already stripped bare, as though he had never slept in it at all. No one had explained anything to her that day, nor any day after. When she had asked her father where her brother had gone, he had simply told her that Peter had been sent away for his education, to a distant relation who could better provide for him. Ilara had believed the lie for almost a year, writing letters that were never answered, asking after a school she later learned did not exist. It was her mother who had finally told her the truth, though only in fragments. Late one night when grief and drink had loosened her tongue. "Your father owed a terrible sum to a dangerous man," she had whispered, tears streaming silently down her face. "He had no way to pay it. And so the man took what he could, and what he took was your brother." Ilara had never learned the name of the man to whom her father owed his debt. She had never learned where Peter had been taken, or whether he lived still, or what kind of life, if any, he had been forced into. Her father had died still refusing to speak the truth aloud, taking whatever answers he possessed into the silence of his own grave, leaving Ilara with nothing but a wound that had never closed, and a question that had shaped the whole of her adult life without ever being answered. She often wondered, in these quiet Marchfield afternoons, whether Peter still remembered her at all, whether he remembered the sound of her voice reading him stories, or the way she used to carry him on her back through the garden when he grew too tired to walk, whether he was even still alive to remember anything. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts one such afternoon, and Ilara looked up to find Alaric standing in the doorway of the small sitting room where she often spent her hours, a place with better light for reading than her own chambers. "You look troubled," he said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of hesitation. "I did not mean to intrude." "You are not intruding," Ilara said, quickly composing herself. smoothing the folds of her skirt as though that alone could smooth away the sorrow that must have shown plainly on her face. I was simply lost in thought. He lingered a moment longer than she expected, his gaze studying her with an intensity that made her feel strangely exposed, as though he could see straight through the careful composure she wore like armor. "You may speak freely with me," he said finally, "whatever burdens you." The offer surprised her so completely that she almost laughed, though there was no humor in the sound that nearly escaped her. In a month of marriage, he had barely spoken 100 words to her beyond simple courtesies, and now he stood before her offering to share her burdens, as though such intimacy could be summoned so easily between two strangers bound only by a contract. "Forgive me," she said instead, choosing caution over honesty, "but I do not yet know you well enough to share such things." Something flickered across his face again, that same fleeting expression she had seen on their wedding day, gone before she could name it. He nodded once, accepting her answer without argument, though a shadow of disappointment seemed to linger in his eyes as he turned to leave. "Alaric," she said suddenly, surprising herself by using his given name for the first time. He paused in the doorway, turning back to face her. "Thank you," she said simply, "for asking." A faint, almost imperceptible softening touched the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that Alara found herself wondering, for the first time since her wedding day, whether the man everyone called cruel might be hiding something far gentler beneath his careful, guarded exterior. That evening at dinner, their conversation stretched longer than usual. Alaric asked, tentatively, about her childhood, and Alara found herself speaking of small, safe memories, of her mother's garden and the sound of rain against old windows, careful to steer clear of the deeper wounds she was not yet ready to expose. In turn, he shared fragments of his own past, speaking of a father who had been distant and demanding, of a title inherited far too young, of responsibilities that had settled onto his shoulders before he had ever had the chance to be a boy. "You did not choose this life," Alara said quietly, understanding dawning slowly within her. "Any more than I chose mine?" "No," Alaric agreed, his voice low. "Neither of us did." For a moment, something like understanding passed between them, fragile and new. A thread stretched thin across the distance that had separated them since their wedding day. It was not affection, not yet, but it was something. A small crack in the careful walls they had both built around themselves. Later that night, as Alara made her way to her chambers, she paused once more outside the locked door at the end of the corridor. She did not touch it this time, only studied it from a respectful distance, wondering what secret Alaric guarded so fiercely behind that heavy iron lock. She thought of Peter, wondering if he too stood somewhere in the world, staring at doors that would not open, carrying secrets and sorrows of his own. She thought of Alaric, a man shaped by a childhood cut short by duty, carrying wounds he had not yet learned to share, and she thought of herself, caught between two mysteries, one behind a locked door just steps from her own chambers, and one buried somewhere in a past she could not fully piece together. Whatever waited behind that door, and whatever answers time might eventually bring about her brother's fate, Alara found herself, for the first time since her wedding day, feeling less alone in the search for both. The following days brought small, steady changes to the rhythm of the household. Alaric began seeking her out more often, joining her for walks through the garden in the cool morning air, asking after her opinions on matters he once would have decided alone. Mrs. Prescott, perhaps sensing the shift in her master's demeanor, grew noticeably more accommodating, even offering Alara a rare, genuine smile one afternoon, when she praised the housekeeper's careful management of the household accounts. Yet even as warmth crept slowly into her new life, Alara could not shake the sense that something remained unresolved beneath the surface of Marchfield House. She noticed, more than once, letters arriving for Alaric that he read in private, his expression darkening before he folded them away and locked them in his desk. She noticed, too, the way his gaze sometimes lingered on her with a weight she could not quite interpret, as though he were turning over some private matter in his mind that he was not yet ready to share. She told herself it was simply the natural caution of a new marriage, two strangers still learning the shape of each other's silences. But some quiet instinct, the same one that had drawn her to that locked door on her very first night in the house, told her that there was more to her husband's careful reserve than simple shyness or duty. Whatever it was, she resolved to be patient. She had waited years already for answers about her brother. She could wait a little longer to understand the man she had married. One rainy afternoon, confined indoors by weather too fierce for walking, Alara found herself wandering the long gallery on the second floor of the house, a corridor lined with portraits stretching back through generations of the Marchfield family. She had passed through it many times before, but on this day, with little else to occupy her, She paused before each painted face, studying the resemblance that carried down through the years. The same dark hair, the same guarded set of the jaw that she had come to recognize in her husband. Near the end of the gallery, she stopped before a portrait unlike the others. It showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her hand resting on the shoulder of a young boy who could not have been more than 7 or 8 years old. The boy's face bore an unmistakable resemblance to Alaric, though softened by youth, his expression carrying none of the guarded weight she had come to associate with her husband. "My mother," a voice said quietly from behind her, and Alara turned to find Alaric standing at the entrance of the gallery, his eyes fixed on the same portrait. "She died when I was 9 years old. Fever," the physician said, though I have never been certain they truly knew the cause. "I am sorry," Alara said softly, and she meant it, understanding all too well the particular ache of losing a parent too soon. "My father was never the same afterward," Alaric continued, moving to stand beside her, his gaze still fixed on the painted image of his mother. He grew distant, consumed by the title and its responsibilities, as though burying himself in duty could dull the grief. "I inherited both the title and that same instinct rather young, I am afraid. It is easier sometimes to hide behind duty than to sit with sorrow." Alara studied his profile as he spoke, struck by the rare vulnerability in his voice, so different from the careful, guarded man she had married. "Is that why they call you cold?" she asked before she could stop herself, immediately wishing she could take the question back. But Alaric did not seem offended. Instead, a tired, almost rueful expression crossed his face. "Perhaps," he admitted. "It is easier to let people believe the worst of you than to explain grief you have never learned how to voice aloud." They stood together in silence for a long moment, the rain tapping steadily against the tall windows of the gallery, the portrait of his mother watching over them both. "Thank you for telling me," Alara said finally. "Thank you for asking," he replied, echoing the very words she had once offered him, and this time, the smile that touched his lips was unmistakable, small and brief, but entirely genuine. From that day forward, something between them shifted more visibly. Alaric began joining her more often in the evenings, sometimes reading quietly in the same room while she worked at her embroidery, the silence between them no longer heavy with tension but comfortable in a way she had not expected marriage to a stranger could ever become. He asked, on occasion, about her family, and though Alara still guarded the deepest wound of her brother's disappearance, she found herself sharing small memories of her childhood, of her father before the debts had consumed him, of simpler days she had thought she'd buried too deep to speak of again. Yet even as warmth grew steadily between them, Alara remained aware of the careful boundaries Alaric maintained around certain parts of his life: the locked room, the letters he read in private, his expression darkening before he folded them away. A solicitor who visited twice in 1 week, closeted with Alaric for hours behind the closed door of his study, their voices too low for Alara to make out any words through the heavy wood. She told herself, again and again, that patience would serve her better than suspicion. Every marriage held its private corners, its secrets not yet ready to be shared. She had her own, after all. The wound of her brother's disappearance that she had not yet found the courage to voice aloud to the man she was only beginning to trust. But as the weeks passed, and the solicitor's visits continued with a frequency that seemed to trouble Alaric more each time, Alara found her patience wearing thinner than she cared to admit. Something was happening beneath the surface of their careful, growing peace, something Alaric was not yet ready to share, and Alara could not shake the growing sense that whatever it was, it might change everything between them once it finally came to light. The invitation arrived on a crisp morning, sealed with the crest of a family Alara did not recognize, addressed to both the Duke and Duchess of Marchfield for a ball to be held at the end of the week. "Lord Castellan," Alaric explained over breakfast, his voice carrying a note of tension. Alara had not heard from him in some time. "My cousin, on my father's side, we are not close." "You seem troubled by the invitation," Alara observed, setting down her teacup. "Edmund has never forgiven me for inheriting the title," Alaric said simply. "He believes it should have passed to him, through a distant claim he has pursued in the courts twice now, and lost twice. He is not a man who accepts loss gracefully." Alara felt a small chill settle over her at his words, though she said nothing more on the matter, choosing instead to focus on the practical matter of what she might wear to an event that would mark her first appearance in society as Alaric's wife. The days leading up to the ball passed in a flurry of preparation. A seamstress was summoned to fit Alara for a gown of deep blue silk, and Nora spent hours arranging and rearranging Alara's hair until she pronounced herself satisfied. Through it all, Alara felt the familiar knot of anxiety returning to her stomach, the same one that had gripped her on her wedding day. She would be presented to society for the first time not as Alara Whitmore, a woman of diminished fortune, but as the Duchess of Marchfield, wife to a man whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered. On the evening of the ball, Alara stood before her mirror as Nora fastened the final clasp of her gown, studying her own reflection with a critical eye. The woman staring back at her looked every inch a duchess, poised and elegant, though the calm expression she wore was carefully constructed over a storm of nerves beneath. Alaric met her at the top of the staircase, and something in his expression shifted as he took in the sight of her, a warmth in his eyes that had grown more familiar in recent weeks, though it still caught her off guard each time she noticed it. "You look every inch the Duchess," he said quietly, offering his arm. "I feel like an imposter," she admitted, allowing him to lead her down the staircase. "You are no imposter," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever anyone says tonight, remember that." His words settled some of her nerves, though she could not have known how quickly she would need to remember them. The Castellan estate glittered with candlelight when they arrived, the ballroom filled with London's finest, gowns of silk and jewels catching the light with every turn. Alara felt the weight of countless eyes upon her as she entered on Alaric's arm, whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through tall grass. She held her chin high, remembering her mother's old advice from a lifetime ago, though the advice had once been meant to help her survive poverty, rather than the scrutiny of a ballroom. Lord Edmund Castellan approached them within the first quarter hour, a tall man with sharp features and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Cousin," he said smoothly, bowing just low enough to satisfy propriety while somehow managing to make the gesture feel like an insult. "And this must be your new Duchess. How fortunate you were, to find a bride so quickly after your engagement to Lady Vance fell apart so scandalously." Alara felt Alaric stiffen beside her, though his expression remained carefully composed. "Edmund," he said, his voice cool, "I did not realize old history still interested you so much." "Old history has a way of becoming relevant again," Edmund replied, his gaze shifting to Alara with an assessing coldness that made her skin prickle with discomfort. "Tell me, my lady, did your husband mention to you the circumstances of his broken engagement before you agreed to marry him, or did the promise of a title outweigh your curiosity?" The insinuation landed like a slap, though Alara forced herself to remain composed, refusing to give Edmund the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "My husband and I have no secrets between us that concern you, Lord Castellan," she said evenly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Something flickered in Edmund's eyes, surprise perhaps, or irritation at finding her less easily unsettled than he had hoped. He offered a thin smile and excused himself, disappearing back into the crowd, though Alara did not miss the way he paused to speak with a cluster of gossiping matrons near the refreshment table, his head bent low in conspiratorial conversation. "I apologize for that," Alaric said quietly once Edmund had gone. "He has always sought ways to wound me. It seems he has decided you make an easier target." "I am not so easily wounded," Alara replied, though the confidence in her voice was hard-won. The rest of the evening passed with careful civility, though Alara noticed the whispers following her throughout the ballroom, noticed the way certain women drew their skirts aside as she passed, as though poverty were a disease that might still cling to her despite her new title. She held her composure through it all, greeting each new introduction with the same steady grace, though inside she felt the familiar sting of judgment she had known since her father's debts had first become public knowledge among the gentry. A young woman named Charlotte, wife to a viscount and one of the few who greeted Alara with genuine warmth rather than cool curiosity, drew her aside near the refreshment table to offer quiet encouragement. "Pay them no mind," Charlotte said, nodding subtly toward a cluster of whispering matrons near the far wall. "They speak so only because they envy what they cannot have. A husband who looks at his wife the way the Duke looks at you is a rare thing in this room, whatever fortune or title accompanies it." Alara managed a small, grateful smile, though her mind was still turning over the strange comment Edmund had made about Alaric's broken engagement. "Did you know his previous betrothed?" she asked carefully. "Lady Vance," Charlotte said, lowering her voice further. "A cold, ambitious creature, if you ask my honest opinion. She wanted the title far more than she wanted the man attached to it. When she grew impatient waiting for him to set a date, she began courting a wealthier prospect behind his back, thinking herself clever enough not to be discovered. The Duke discovered it regardless, and ended things swiftly and without public scandal, which was more mercy than she deserved, though society preferred to imagine him the villain of that particular story, rather than believe such calculation of a woman in silk. The revelation settled something uneasy in Alara's chest, a piece of the puzzle of her husband's reputation clicking quietly into place. Perhaps the coldness the world attributed to Alaric was not cruelty at all, but simply the scar tissue of a man who had learned, through hard experience, to guard himself carefully against those who might use him for his title alone. She danced twice with Alaric as the evening wore on, his hands steady at her waist, his eyes rarely leaving hers, and for those brief moments, the rest of the room seemed to fade into insignificance. He was, she noticed, a surprisingly graceful dancer, guiding her through the steps with an ease that suggested years of practice beneath the careful, guarded exterior he showed the world. "You dance as though you enjoy it," she observed during their second dance, watching a rare flicker of amusement cross his face. "I enjoy very little about occasions such as this," he admitted, "but I find myself making an exception tonight." "And why is that?" she asked, unable to resist the small thrill his words sent through her. "Perhaps because, for the first time in longer than I care to admit, I am not standing in a ballroom feeling entirely alone," he said quietly, and something in his tone told her the admission had cost him more than his usual careful composure typically allowed. It was near the end of the evening, as Alara stood momentarily alone near the edge of the ballroom while Alaric spoke with an old acquaintance, that Edmund approached her again, his expression carrying none of the false civility from earlier. "You play your part well," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "But do not mistake his sudden warmth for genuine affection. My cousin married you for one reason only, to settle debts and secure an heir. Whatever tenderness you believe you have found is nothing more than duty wearing a convincing mask. You know nothing of what exists between my husband and myself," Alara said, her voice tight with barely restrained anger. "I know Alaric better than you ever will," Edmund replied, his smile turning cruel. "I know, for instance, that there are matters he has kept from you, matters concerning your own family that might interest you a great deal, should you ever think to ask him directly." Alara's heart lurched painfully in her chest. "What do you mean by that?" But Edmund only smiled wider, clearly satisfied to have finally found a crack in her composure. "Ask your husband," he said simply, "about the solicitor's visits, and the letters he keeps locked away in his study. Ask him what business a duke has inquiring after the fate of a boy sold off to pay a dead man's debts." Before Alara could respond, Edmund melted back into the crowd, leaving her standing frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might be heard across the entire ballroom. The carriage ride home was silent, Alara staring out the window at the passing darkness, her mind racing through the implications of Edmund's cruel words. A boy sold off to pay a dead man's debts. It could not be coincidence. It could not be anything other than Peter, though how Alaric could possibly know anything of her brother's fate, and why he had never spoken a word of it to her, she could not begin to understand. "You are quiet," Alaric observed once they arrived home, following her into the entrance hall. "Edmund said something to me tonight," Alara said, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain composed. "Something about a solicitor, and letters, and a boy sold off to pay a debt." She watched the color drain slightly from Alaric's face, watched the careful composure he had maintained throughout the evening crack for just a moment, before he schooled his features back into stillness. "We should not discuss this in the hallway," he said quietly. "Then let us discuss it in your study," Alara said, her voice firmer now, fueled by a fear and a fury that had been building since the moment Edmund had spoken his cruel, cryptic words. "Now, Alaric, I have waited long enough for honesty." He hesitated for a long moment, and in that hesitation, Alara felt her worst fears solidifying into certainty. Whatever secret he had been guarding, whatever the locked room and the solicitor's visits truly meant, it concerned her family, and he had chosen, for reasons she could not yet fathom, to keep it from her. "Very well," Alaric said finally, his voice heavy with something that sounded almost like relief, as though a burden he had carried too long was finally about to be set down. "Come with me. It is time you knew the truth." He led her down the corridor, past the entrance hall, toward his study, and Alara followed with her heart hammering against her ribs, uncertain whether she was about to receive the answer she had spent nearly a decade searching for, or a fresh wound to add to all the ones that had never properly healed. The study was a room she had entered only rarely, dominated by tall bookshelves and a heavy oak desk covered in papers arranged with meticulous care. Alaric moved to the desk and unlocked a small drawer with a key he kept on a chain beneath his waistcoat. The same chain, Alara realized with a start, that likely held the key to the locked room upstairs as well. He withdrew a thin bundle of letters, tied together with plain string, and held them for a long moment before offering them to her, his expression unreadable in the low light of the study's single lamp. "Before you read these," he said quietly, I need you to understand that I did not seek out this information to hurt you, nor to keep secrets for the sake of secrecy alone. I began this inquiry before we were even wed, and I have hesitated to speak of it only because I could not bear to offer you hope that might yet prove false." Alara's hands trembled as she took the letters from him, her mind already racing ahead of whatever words might be written within them. Hope of what? She asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, had suspected it since the moment Edmund had spoken his cruel, cryptic words in the ballroom. "Of your brother," Alaric said softly. "Of Peter." The name, spoken aloud in her husband's voice for the first time, struck Alara with a force that nearly buckled her knees. She sank into the chair before his desk, the letters clutched tightly in her trembling hands, and looked up at him with a mixture of desperate hope and lingering fear that he might yet prove Edmund's cruel insinuations correct, that whatever tenderness had grown between them might indeed be nothing more than duty wearing a convincing mask. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I have waited too long for half-truths in silence." Alaric drew a chair beside her own and sat, his eyes steady on hers despite the vulnerability she could see plainly beneath his careful composure. "When our marriage was first arranged," he began, "I made it my business, as I do with any matter concerning my household, to learn what I could of your family's history. It was in the course of that inquiry that I first heard rumors, whispered among men who deal in such dark business, of a boy sold years ago to settle a gambling debt owed by a gentleman named Whitmore." Alara's breath caught painfully in her throat. "I did not know, at first, whether the rumor concerned your family at all," Alaric continued. "There are many men who share your father's surname, and debts of that nature are, unfortunately, not so rare among the gentry as polite society would prefer to believe. But something in the story troubled me enough that I engaged a solicitor to investigate further, quietly, without raising false expectations before I had cause to believe them justified." "And what did you learn?" Alara asked, her voice trembling with a hope she barely dared to feel. "Only fragments, so far," Alaric admitted. "Enough to believe the boy in question may indeed be your brother, though I have not yet confirmed his current whereabouts, nor even whether he still lives. I did not tell you sooner because I could not bear the thought of offering you false hope, only to watch it crushed if the trail proved false or led nowhere at all." Alara stared down at the letters in her lap, the string still knotted tight around them, unread words that might hold the key to a decade of unanswered grief. "You should have told me," she said, though her voice carried more relief than anger now. "Whatever the outcome, I deserve to know you were searching at all." "You are right," Alaric said quietly. "I see that now. I have grown too accustomed to carrying burdens alone, to protecting others from uncertainty, rather than trusting them to bear it alongside me. It is a habit I intend to break, if you will allow me the chance to prove it." Alara looked up at him then, seeing past the guarded duke that London whispered about, past even the careful, thoughtful husband she had begun to know these past weeks, to something rawer and more honest beneath, a man who had spent a decade of his own grief learning to hide behind duty, only now beginning to understand that some burdens were never meant to be carried alone. "Read them," Alaric said gently, nodding toward the letters still clutched in her hands. "I will be here, whatever they reveal." With trembling fingers, Alara finally untied the string and began to read, the study falling silent save for the soft rustle of paper and the distant, steady sound of rain that had begun once more against the tall windows, as though the whole world were holding its breath alongside her, waiting to learn at last what had become of the brother she had never stopped searching for. The letters told a story more painful than Alara had prepared herself to read. The solicitor's careful, formal hand described a trail that began nearly a decade ago, when a man named Garrick Holloway, a moneylender known in certain circles for his ruthless methods of collection, had accepted an 8-year-old boy in place of a debt her father could not otherwise repay. The boy had been taken north, according to the earliest records, to work on a tenant farm owned by one of Holloway's business associates, a common enough arrangement among men who dealt in such dark, unspoken business, where the labor of an unwanted child could be quietly absorbed into a household in exchange for the forgiveness of a debt. From there, the trail grew thinner. Records showed the boy had remained at the farm for perhaps 3 years before being moved again, this time to a larger estate further north still, where he was said to have worked in the stables. After that, the solicitor's notes grew increasingly uncertain, mentioning only fragments and rumors, a boy matching the description working as an apprentice to a blacksmith in a market town, though whether this was truly the same child remained unconfirmed. Alara read the pages twice, her hands trembling, tears blurring the careful handwriting by the time she reached the final page, which ended not with an answer but with a promise from the solicitor to continue his inquiries in the region where the trail had last been warm. "He is alive," she whispered, looking up at Alaric with an expression caught between overwhelming hope and a grief so old it had become part of her very bones. Or he was, 3 years past, when these notes were last written. "The solicitor believes the trail is still worth pursuing," Alaric said gently. "He has not given up, and neither must you. I have instructed him to spare no expense in continuing the search." Elara pressed the letters to her chest, as though she could somehow draw her brother closer simply by holding the pages that spoke of him. "Why would you spend such money, such effort, on a stranger's family history?" she asked, though the question carried no accusation now, only genuine wonder. Alaric was quiet for a long moment before answering, his eyes fixed on some point beyond her, as though searching for the right words among memories he did not often revisit. "When my mother died," he said finally, "my father grew so consumed by grief that he forgot, for a time, that he still had a living son who needed him. I spent many nights as a boy wondering if anyone in the world was still searching for me, even as I sat in the very same house where I had always lived. It was not the same as your circumstance, I know that. But I understood, perhaps better than most, what it means to feel forgotten, to wonder if anyone still cares enough to look." The rawness in his voice undid something in Alara's chest, some final wall of caution she had maintained since her wedding day. She reached across the small space between their chairs and took his hand, and he did not pull away. "Thank you," she said softly, "for looking for him, when you had no obligation to do so. You are my wife," Alaric said simply, though his eyes carried a depth of feeling that suggested the word meant far more to him now than the cold, contractual arrangement it had represented on their wedding day. "Your grief is mine to share, if you will allow it." They sat together long into the night, Elara asking questions about the search, about Holloway and the farms in the market town where the trail had gone cold, while Alaric answered each one patiently, sharing every detail he possessed. For the first time since her father's death, Elara did not feel entirely alone in carrying the weight of her brother's disappearance. She had, in her husband, an unexpected ally, a man who understood grief well enough to sit with hers rather than rushing to smooth it away with empty comfort. In the days that followed, the household seemed to sense the shift between them, though no one spoke of it openly. Mrs. Prescott's demeanor softened further still, and even the more distant members of the staff began greeting Elara with genuine warmth rather than careful, professional civility. Nora, in particular, seemed delighted by the change, humming softly to herself as she arranged Elara's hair each morning, occasionally sharing small observations about how much brighter the house felt of late. "If I may say so, my lady," Nora ventured one morning, "His Grace has not smiled so often in all the years I have served here. Whatever has changed, I hope it continues." Elara found herself smiling at the observation, warmth spreading through her chest at the thought that others had noticed the change in Alaric as clearly as she had felt it herself. Yet even as warmth grew steadily between them, the specter of Edmund's cruelty at the ball lingered in Elara's mind. She could not forget the calculated way he had approached her, nor the satisfaction in his voice as he revealed just enough to wound her before withdrawing back into the crowd. She mentioned it to Alaric one evening as they sat together in the small sitting room that had become their favored place for quiet conversation. "Edmund will not stop with a single evening's cruelty," Alaric said grimly when she described the encounter in full. "He has spent years searching for any weakness he might exploit to damage my reputation, hoping perhaps to force some scandal that might yet win him sympathy in his pursuit of the title through the courts. I fear he saw in you a new opportunity, a way to wound me by wounding you instead." "I am not afraid of him," Elara said, though a small knot of unease remained in her stomach at the memory of Edmund's cold, calculating smile. "You should not need to be afraid of him," Alaric said, his jaw tightening with a protectiveness that warmed something deep within her chest. "I will not allow him to use either of us as instruments in his petty campaign against me." "What might he do?" Elara asked, unable to shake the feeling that Edmund's cruelty at the ball had been merely a first move in some larger game. Alaric's expression grew troubled. "I do not know precisely," he admitted, "but Edmund is not a man who abandons a scheme easily, particularly not one that offers him the possibility of public embarrassment at my expense. We should remain watchful in the weeks ahead." His words proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. Barely a week later, a note arrived from Lady Castellan, Edmund's own wife, inviting them to a smaller, more intimate gathering to be held at the Castellan townhouse, ostensibly to celebrate the engagement of a mutual acquaintance. Alaric's expression darkened the moment he read the invitation. "This is Edmund's doing," he said grimly, passing the note to Elara. He would not typically trouble himself with such small social gatherings, unless he saw some advantage in drawing us into his own territory once more. Should we decline? Alara asked. Alaric considered the question for a long moment, his jaw set in the same stubborn line she had come to associate with his more determined moods. No, he said finally. To decline would only confirm to society that we fear whatever game he intends to play. Better to attend, forewarned, and meet whatever scheme he has prepared with steady composure rather than retreat. Alara nodded, though the knot of unease in her stomach tightened further at the thought of facing Edmund's cruelty again so soon. Still, she found herself drawing strength from the steady presence of her husband beside her, from the genuine partnership that had grown between them in these past weeks of shared grief and cautious hope. Whatever he intends, she said, lifting her chin with a determination that surprised even herself, we will face it together. Alaric's expression softened into something that looked remarkably like pride. Together, he agreed, and the words settled between them like a promise neither intended to break. As the day of the Castellan gathering approached, Alara found herself thinking often of Peter, wondering whether he too had found some small measure of kindness in whatever life circumstance had forced upon him, whether some stranger's unexpected warmth had helped him endure the years of separation from the only family he had ever known. She prayed, in the quiet moments before sleep each night, that wherever he was safe, and that the solicitor's continued search might soon bring the answers she had waited nearly a decade to receive. For now, though, a more immediate concern demanded her attention. Whatever Edmund intended to unleash at his wife's gathering, Alara resolved to meet it not as the frightened, uncertain bride who had first arrived at Marchfield House, but as a duchess who had found, in her marriage of convenience, an unexpected foundation of genuine partnership and growing love, one strong enough, she hoped, to withstand whatever cruelty her husband's cousin still had planned. 2 evenings before the Castellan gathering, Alaric surprised her by suggesting they visit the locked room together, a gesture she understood immediately to carry far greater weight than the simple offer of a tour. He led her up the staircase and down the familiar corridor, past her own chambers, to the heavy door she had studied so many times from a respectful distance. He drew the key from the chain beneath his waistcoat and turned it slowly in the lock, the mechanism giving way with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet of the corridor. Inside, Alara found not the dark, foreboding mystery her imagination had constructed over the weeks, but a small nursery, untouched by time, a narrow bed still made with faded linens, a wooden horse resting on a shelf beside a scattering of children's books. This was my room, as a boy, Alaric said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. After my mother died, my father ordered it sealed, unable to bear the sight of it, though he never permitted anyone to clear it away either. I kept it locked all these years for much the same reason, I suppose. It is easier to guard a grief than to face it. Alara stepped carefully into the small room, taking in the dust-covered evidence of a childhood cut short by loss. Why show me now? She asked gently. Because you have trusted me with your own grief, Alaric said, and it seemed only right that I offer the same in return. I do not wish for there to be locked doors between us any longer, Alara. Not the literal kind, nor the kind we build within ourselves. The simple honesty of his words brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She reached for his hand, and together they stood in the small, dust-covered nursery. Two people shaped by loss-finding, unexpectedly, a shared language for grief that neither had known how to voice before. We will find him, Alaric said softly, his hand tightening around hers. Whatever it takes, whatever the search requires, we will find your brother, and when we do, he will have a home here, with us, for as long as he wishes it. The promise settled into Alara's chest like a warmth she had not felt since childhood, since the days before Peter's disappearance had hollowed out some essential piece of her heart. She looked up at her husband, this man the whole of London still whispered about as cold and cruel, and saw instead someone who had spent his own childhood learning to guard his wounds in silence, only now beginning to understand that shared grief, spoken honestly, could heal far more than solitary suffering ever could. Thank you, she whispered, and this time, when he drew her gently into his arms, she did not hesitate to lean into the embrace, finding there a comfort she had not known she still needed, until the very moment she received it. They lingered in the small nursery a while longer, Alaric pointing out small details from his boyhood, the carved initials on the underside of the wooden horse, a faded drawing pinned above the bed that he confessed, with a rare, easy laugh, he had made for his mother when he was no older than 5. Alara listened to each memory with quiet attention, treasuring the sight of her husband speaking so freely of a past he had guarded so carefully until now. "Perhaps," she said softly, as they finally made their way back toward the corridor, "when Peter is found, we might bring some warmth back into this room. Children's laughter has a way of chasing off old sorrow, I think, if we allow it the chance." Alaric turned to look at her, something tender and hopeful crossing his features. "I would like that very much," he said. "More than I can easily express." He locked the door behind them once more, though this time the gesture felt different, not the sealing away of an old wound, but the careful preservation of a memory now shared rather than hidden. As they walked back toward their own chambers, hand in hand, Alara felt, for the first time since her wedding day, that Marchfield House was beginning to feel less like a grand and lonely fortress, and more like a home, slowly filling with the promise of a future neither of them had expected to find, within a marriage born of debt and convenience. That night, she slept more peacefully than she had and longer than she could remember, her dreams no longer haunted by narrow hallways and vanishing children, but filled instead with a quiet, steady warmth, as though some part of her heart had finally begun to believe that answers, and perhaps even happiness, were within reach at last. The Castellan townhouse was smaller than the estate where the previous ball had been held, but no less crowded, the drawing room filled with a select gathering of London's most influential families, all invited, Alara suspected, for reasons that had little to do with celebrating any engagement. Lady Castellan greeted them at the door with a warmth that seemed genuine enough, though Alara caught the nervous glance the woman cast toward her husband across the room, as though seeking permission for even the smallest courtesy. Edmund stood near the fireplace, engaged in conversation with a cluster of gentlemen Alara did not recognize, though his eyes found hers almost immediately upon their arrival, a cold, calculating smile spreading across his face. "He is enjoying this already," Alaric murmured, his hand tightening protectively around Alara's own. "Stay close to me tonight." They mingled carefully through the early part of the evening, exchanging polite conversation with acquaintances Alara had begun to recognize from the previous ball. Charlotte, the kind Viscountess who had offered such welcome comfort before, found her again near the refreshment table, though this time her expression carried a note of concern rather than simple friendliness. "Be careful tonight," Charlotte warned quietly. "There is talk circulating already, whispers that Lord Castellan intends some manner of announcement before the evening concludes. I do not know the particulars, but the way he has been smiling all evening troubles me greatly." Alara thanked her for the warning, though the knot of unease in her stomach had already tightened considerably by the time she rejoined Alaric near the center of the room. As they moved deeper into the gathering, Alara found herself introduced to a number of families she had not yet met, each greeting carrying its own careful shade of curiosity. A dowager countess with sharp eyes studied her for a long moment before offering a surprisingly kind smile. "You carry yourself well, my dear," the woman said. "Better than I expected, given how quickly this marriage was arranged. I confess I doubted the match would suit either of you, but the Duke has not looked so at ease in company since before his mother passed. Whatever you have done, continue doing it." Alara thanked her, uncertain how to respond to such blunt candor, though the words settled warmly in her chest regardless. She glanced toward Alaric, who stood a short distance away in conversation with a gentleman she did not recognize, and found herself struck once more by how different he seemed from the guarded, distant man who had greeted her on her wedding day. He laughed at something the gentleman said, an easy, genuine sound that carried none of the careful restraint she had grown so accustomed to during their first weeks of marriage. A young woman near her own age approached shortly after, introducing herself as a cousin of Charlotte's, eager to discuss the latest fashions arriving from Paris, and for a brief while, Alara allowed herself the simple pleasure of ordinary conversation, unburdened by scandal or suspicion. It was, she realized, the first time since her wedding that she had felt something approaching genuine belonging within London society, rather than the constant, wary sense of being watched and judged. The feeling did not last long. It was perhaps an hour into the gathering when Edmund finally made his move, raising his voice just enough to draw the attention of the nearby guests without appearing to seek it deliberately. "Cousin," he called out, his tone carrying false warmth that fooled no one paying close attention. "I wonder if you might indulge us with an explanation. There has been such curious talk of late, concerning certain private inquiries you have commissioned, a solicitor making discreet visits, letters exchanged with men of questionable reputation in the north. One does begin to wonder what business a duke might have with matters so far beneath his usual concerns." The nearby conversations quieted immediately, guests turning with the particular hunger of those who sensed scandal blooming in their midst. Alara felt her pulse quicken, though she forced herself to remain outwardly composed, remembering Alaric's steady presence beside her. "My private affairs are precisely that, Edmund," Alaric said evenly, though Elara could feel the tension radiating from him. "Private. Come now," Edmund pressed, clearly relishing the growing audience his words had gathered. "Surely there can be no harm in satisfying simple curiosity among family. Unless, of course, there is something to hide. Some might even suggest, given the timing of your sudden marriage and these curious inquiries that followed so closely after, that your motives in wedding Miss Whitmore, forgive me, the Duchess, were rather more calculated than the romantic tale society has been so eager to believe." Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, and Elara felt heat rise to her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or fury she could not entirely say. She opened her mouth to respond, but Alaric's hand tightened gently around her own, a silent request for patience. "You wish to discuss calculation, Edmund?" Alaric said, his voice carrying a new edge that silenced the murmuring crowd almost instantly. "Very well, let us discuss calculation. Let us discuss the twice-failed court petitions you have filed these past 3 years, each one built upon a claim to my title, that even your own solicitors privately admit holds no legal merit. Let us discuss the considerable debts you have accumulated at the card tables of 3 separate gentlemen's clubs, debts you have thus far avoided settling through nothing more than the temporary patience of creditors who still believe, mistakenly, that a title might one day fall into your possession to cover what you owe." Edmund's confident expression faltered for the first time that evening, color draining slightly from his face as murmurs of surprise rippled anew through the gathered crowd, though this time the curious attention had shifted decisively away from Alaric and toward the man who had sought to expose him. "That is a private matter," Edmund said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "As private, I would think, as my own affairs," Alaric replied smoothly. "Yet you saw fit to raise the matter of privacy publicly tonight, so I saw no reason to extend you a courtesy you were not prepared to extend to me." A few scattered, uncomfortable laughs rippled through the onlookers, and Elara watched with a mixture of relief and quiet admiration as the tide of public opinion shifted visibly away from Edmund's carefully staged accusation. But Edmund, clearly unwilling to surrender so easily, turned his attention back toward Elara herself, his expression hardening with something closer to genuine malice. "Perhaps the Duchess herself might satisfy our curiosity then," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Tell us, my lady, what business does your husband truly have inquiring after some boy from your family's past? Surely such curious secrecy deserves an honest explanation, if there is truly nothing shameful to conceal." The room fell silent, every eye turning toward Elara, and for a moment, the old fear she had carried since her wedding day threatened to overwhelm her, the fear of judgment, of exposure, of having her family's private grief laid bare before strangers who would only ever see scandal where there existed only sorrow. But then she felt Alaric's hand still steady around her own, felt the quiet strength of his presence beside her, and something within her settled into a calm she had not known she possessed. "There is no shame in what my husband has done," Elara said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, steadier than she had believed possible. "When I was 12 years old, my younger brother was taken from our family, sold to settle a debt my father could not otherwise repay. For nearly a decade, I did not know whether he lived or died, whether he remembered me at all, whether any trace of him remained to be found. My husband, upon learning of this grief, chose to commission an inquiry into his fate, not out of some calculated scheme, but out of simple kindness, a desire to ease a sorrow I had carried alone for far too long." She paused, drawing a steadying breath, aware of the weight of every eye still fixed upon her, though the quality of their attention had shifted from hungry curiosity to something closer to sympathy. "If Lord Castellan finds such kindness worthy of scandal," Elara continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "then I confess I do not understand the values by which he chooses to measure honor. I would think a man's willingness to spend his own resources easing a stranger's grief speaks rather more to his character than any title or fortune ever could." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, several guests nodding, one older gentleman even offering a small, respectful bow in Elara's direction. Edmund's face had gone pale with fury and humiliation. His earlier confidence entirely evaporated beneath the unexpected turn his scheme had taken. "This is absurd," he said, though his voice carried none of its earlier conviction. "You twist my words, both of you, to paint yourselves as saints when—" "Enough, Edmund," Lady Castellan interrupted suddenly, stepping forward with an expression of mortified apology, clearly having reached the limit of her patience for her husband's public humiliation of their guests. "You have said quite enough for one evening." Edmund opened his mouth as though to argue further, but the weight of the room's collective disapproval seemed finally to register, and he closed it again, retreating toward the far side of the room with the stiff, wounded posture of a man who had badly miscalculated his own cleverness. Alaric turned to Alara once the crowd had begun to disperse back into smaller, quieter conversations, his expression carrying a depth of admiration that warmed her more thoroughly than any fire in the room. "You did not need my defense at all in the end," he said quietly. "You defended yourself, and rather more effectively than I could have managed alone." "We defended each other," Alara corrected gently, "as we agreed we would." Charlotte found them again, as the evening wound toward its close, her expression bright with genuine admiration. "I do not think Lord Castellan will trouble either of you again so publicly," she said. "Whatever scandal he hoped to create tonight, he has instead handed you both the sympathy and respect of nearly everyone in this room." The carriage ride home was quieter than the one following the previous ball, though the silence between them now carried none of the earlier tension, filled instead with a comfortable warmth that Alara had not thought herself capable of feeling toward the man she had married under such cold, transactional circumstances only months before. "Thank you," Alaric said softly, breaking the silence as the carriage rolled through the darkened London streets, "for trusting me enough to speak so openly tonight. I know it could not have been easy, sharing such a private grief before strangers." "It was easier than I expected," Alara admitted, "because I was not speaking alone. I had you beside me." Alaric reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his thumb tracing a gentle, absent circle across her knuckles. "Always," he said quietly. "Whatever comes, whatever Edmund or anyone else in London attempts against us, you will never again need to face it alone." Alara leaned her head against his shoulder as the carriage carried them home, and for the first time since her wedding day, she allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that the cold, cruel Duke society had warned her about had never truly existed at all, that the man beside her was, and perhaps had always been, someone entirely worth loving. In the days that followed the Castellan gathering, word of the evening's events spread quickly through London's drawing rooms, though the version that circulated bore little resemblance to the scandal Edmund had hoped to create. Instead, the story that traveled from household to household spoke of a devoted duke who had spent his own fortune easing his new wife's private grief, and of a duchess who had spoken with such quiet dignity about her lost brother that even the most hardened gossips found themselves genuinely moved. Invitations began arriving at Marchfield House with a warmth and frequency that surprised Alara considerably, hostesses eager now to include the Duke and Duchess among their most valued guests, where once they might have offered only cautious, obligatory courtesy. Charlotte visited twice in the following week, quickly becoming a genuine friend rather than merely a kind acquaintance, and even Mrs. Prescott mentioned, with something approaching pride, that she had overheard several tradesmen in the village speaking admiringly of the household she managed. Edmund, for his part, seemed to vanish entirely from society for a time, Lady Castellan appearing at gatherings alone, offering only vague, uncomfortable explanations for her husband's absence. Alaric mentioned, one evening over dinner, that he had received word Edmund's creditors had grown considerably less patient following the public exposure of his debts, though he expressed the news with more weariness than satisfaction. "I take no pleasure in his misfortune," Alaric admitted. "Whatever cruelty he has shown us, he is family still, however distant, and I confess I hope he finds some way to settle his affairs honestly, rather than continue down whatever reckless path has brought him to this point." Alara found herself admiring this quality in her husband more than almost any other, this capacity for genuine compassion even toward those who had wronged him, a gentleness that society's whispered rumors had never once prepared her to expect from the man they called cruel. As autumn settled fully over London, bringing shorter days and cooler evenings, Alara's thoughts turned increasingly toward the solicitor's continued search for Peter. Alaric had written twice more in recent weeks, urging the man to spare no expense in following whatever leads remained, and though no new information had yet arrived, Alara found herself carrying a steadier, more patient hope than she had known in years, buoyed by the certainty that she no longer waited for answers alone. She spent her evenings now not in solitary worry, but in quiet companionship with her husband, sometimes reading together in comfortable silence, sometimes talking late into the night about small hopes for whatever future might yet unfold, whether Peter's search concluded in joy or required still more patience before it found its resolution. Whatever answers awaited them, Alara had come to understand she would face them now with a partner beside her, rather than the frightened, uncertain bride who had once stood alone in an unfamiliar carriage, dreading the cruel stranger she believed awaited her at journey's end. One crisp evening, as they walked together through the garden beneath a sky just beginning to darken toward twilight, Alaric paused beside the old stone bench near the hedges and turned to face her, his expression unusually solemn. "I must confess something to you," he said quietly. "When our marriage was first arranged, I agreed to it purely as a matter of duty, a practical solution to settle your family's debts while securing an heir for my own line. I expected nothing more from the arrangement than cold civility, perhaps not even that, given the reputation that preceded me into every negotiation. And now?" Alara asked softly, her heart quickening at the rare vulnerability in his voice. "Now," Alaric said, reaching for her hand, "I find myself grateful every single day that duty brought you into my life, because what has grown between us since feels like nothing I ever expected to find, not in this marriage, and perhaps not in any marriage at all. You have taught me that grief shared is grief halved, that walls built to protect the heart only succeed in isolating it further. I did not know, before you, how deeply I still longed for genuine companionship, until you began offering it so freely, despite every reason you had to remain guarded against me." Alara felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes, though they carried none of the sorrow that had so often accompanied her tears in recent years. "I feared you, once," she admitted. "The whole of London had convinced me I was marrying a man without feeling, without kindness. I have never been so grateful to discover myself entirely mistaken." Alaric lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, his eyes steady on hers in the fading evening light. "Whatever comes next," he said, "however Peter's search concludes, however London's opinion shifts and changes as it always does, know that what exists between us now is real, Alara. It is not duty any longer. It has not been duty for some time." "I know," she whispered, and in that quiet garden, beneath a sky deepening slowly toward evening stars, Alara allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to fall in love with the man everyone had once warned her to fear. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, carried in among the usual correspondence with nothing to distinguish it from any other piece of post, and yet the moment Alaric broke the solicitor's seal and began reading, Alara knew instantly that everything was about to change. "He has been found," Alaric said, his voice tight with barely restrained emotion as he looked up from the page. "Alara, the solicitor has found him." The teacup slipped from Alara's fingers, clattering against its saucer as her entire body went still, with a shock so profound it stole the breath from her lungs. "Peter," she whispered, barely able to force the name past the sudden tightness in her throat. "Truly? Are they certain?" Alaric scanned the rest of the letter quickly, his expression shifting through disbelief, relief, and finally a joy so genuine it brought unexpected tears to his own eyes. A young man matching every detail of the description, working as an apprentice to a blacksmith in a market town 3 days' journey north of here. The solicitor spoke with him directly. He confirmed his given name, confirmed being taken from a family home as a child, confirmed a sister he still remembers, though only in fragments, given how young he was when he was taken. Alara pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely down her cheeks now, tears of a joy so overwhelming it felt almost indistinguishable from grief. "He remembers me," she said, the words barely audible. "After all these years, he still remembers." Alaric was at her side in an instant, kneeling before her chair and taking both her hands in his own. "We will leave within the hour," he said firmly. "I will have the carriage prepared immediately. Whatever else waits, this cannot wait another moment longer than necessary." The journey north stretched across 3 long days, each mile carrying Alara closer to an answer she had waited nearly a decade to receive. She slept little during the nights spent at coaching inns along the way, her mind cycling endlessly through memories of Peter as a small boy, wondering what changes a decade of hardship might have wrought upon the child she remembered, wondering whether the young man they were traveling to meet would bear any resemblance at all to the brother who had once chased her laughing through their childhood home. Alaric remained a steady, patient presence throughout the journey, holding her hand during the long hours of travel, offering quiet reassurance whenever her nerves threatened to overwhelm her entirely. "Whatever he has become," he told her gently on the final evening before their arrival, "he is still your brother. That bond does not fade simply because time and distance have kept you apart." The market town, when they finally arrived, proved smaller and quieter than Alara had imagined. A modest collection of shops and cottages arranged around a central square, with a blacksmith's forge situated near the edge of town, smoke rising steadily from its chimney even in the gray light of early morning. Alara's heart pounded so violently as their carriage approached that she feared she might lose consciousness entirely before she ever laid eyes on her brother. Alaric squeezed her hand once, a silent offer of strength, as the carriage rolled to a stop before the forge. A young man emerged from the workshop at the sound of the carriage's arrival, wiping soot-stained hands against a leather apron, his expression curious but wary, the natural caution of a man unaccustomed to visits from finely dressed strangers. He was tall, broad through the shoulders from years of physical labor, his dark hair falling somewhat too long across a face that had grown lean and weathered beyond his years. But his eyes. Alara would have known those eyes anywhere. The same warm brown she remembered from a small boy who used to gaze up at her with such open, trusting affection. The same eyes that had haunted her dreams for nearly a decade. "Peter," she breathed, stepping down from the carriage before Alaric could even offer his assistance, her legs carrying her forward almost without conscious thought. The young man's expression shifted from cautious curiosity to something like stunned disbelief, his hands falling still at his sides as he stared at her, searching her features with an intensity that suggested he too was reaching desperately back through the years for some flicker of recognition. "Alara?" he said finally, his voice rough with disuse and emotion in equal measure. "Is it truly you?" She closed the remaining distance between them in a rush, and he caught her as she nearly collapsed against him, both of them clinging to each other with the desperate strength of two people who had spent a decade believing they might never again have the chance for this exact moment. Alara wept freely against her brother's shoulder, feeling him shake with his own barely contained emotion, his arms wrapped tightly around her, as though he feared she might vanish again if he loosened his grip even slightly. "I never stopped looking for you," she managed finally, pulling back just enough to study his face properly, cataloging every change the years had wrought, the small scar above his eyebrow, the calluses roughening his hands, the quiet strength that had replaced the carefree ease of childhood. "I never stopped hoping you were still alive somewhere in the world. I thought you had forgotten me," Peter admitted, his own tears finally spilling free as he spoke. "I thought, after so many years with no word, no search, that perhaps the family had simply moved forward without me, that I had been too small a loss to warrant remembering." "Never," Alara said fiercely, gripping his hands tightly in her own. "Not for a single day. I searched every way I knew how, though I had so little means or power to search properly, until I married a man who possessed both." She turned then to gesture toward Alaric, who had remained a respectful distance away throughout the reunion, allowing the siblings their privacy, though his expression carried a warmth and satisfaction that spoke volumes about how deeply he, too, had invested himself in this moment's success. "This is my husband," Alara said, drawing Peter's attention toward Alaric, "the Duke of Marchfield. It was his solicitor, funded entirely at his own expense, who finally found the trail that led us to you." Peter's expression shifted to something like wonder as he studied Alaric, clearly struggling to reconcile the presence of a duke with the humble circumstances of the blacksmith's forge where he had spent so many years of hard, quiet labor. "I do not know how to thank you, Your Grace," he said finally, his voice thick with gratitude. "You have given me back the only family I have left in this world." "No thanks are necessary," Alaric said, stepping forward to clasp Peter's hand warmly, without any of the distant formality London society might have expected from a duke addressing a common blacksmith's apprentice. "Your sister's happiness is my own. Finding you has brought her more joy than I believe I have ever witnessed in another person, and for that alone, I count every resource spent in the search entirely worthwhile." They spoke together for hours that day, seated in the small, humble front room of the master blacksmith's cottage, as Peter shared fragments of the years he had spent apart from his family, the hardship of his early years on the tenant farm, the eventual, somewhat kinder circumstances of his apprenticeship, the master blacksmith who had, in his own gruff way, become something like a father figure in the absence of any true family. Alara, in turn, shared what had become of their own parents, the deaths that had claimed their father's final years, the quiet fading of their mother into grief and eventual illness. "I always hoped, somewhere in the back of my mind, that someone might come looking eventually," Peter admitted, as the afternoon light began to soften toward evening. "Though as the years passed, I confess that hope grew harder and harder to sustain." "You need never doubt it again," Alara said firmly, taking his hand once more. "Whatever the years ahead hold, you will not face them alone any longer." Alaric, who had been listening quietly throughout much of the conversation, spoke up then with an offer that brought fresh tears to Alara's eyes. "I would like to extend an invitation," he said, addressing Peter directly. "Marchfield House has more than enough room, and I believe there is a position within the estate that might suit your skills considerably, should you wish to leave this trade behind, or perhaps even continue it under our own patronage, should the craft hold genuine value to you. Whatever you choose, know that you have a home with us for as long as you wish it. No obligation attached beyond the simple bond of family. Peter stared at Alaric for a long moment, clearly overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer, before glancing toward the master blacksmith who had entered quietly during the conversation's final moments, a weathered older man who nodded with what appeared to be genuine, fatherly approval. "Go with your sister, lad," the blacksmith said gruffly. "You have learned all I have to teach you here, and family found again after so long apart is not a gift to be taken lightly. Whatever path you choose beyond this, know you will always be welcome to return, should the grand life ever wear thin." The journey back to London carried none of the anxious uncertainty of the journey north. Peter rode with them, sharing the carriage for the first time in a decade with the sister he had never expected to see again, the two of them talking late into each night of the journey, filling in the gaps of 10 long years apart with stories both joyful and painful in equal measure. Ilara watched her brother and her husband grow steadily more comfortable with each other as the miles passed, Alaric asking thoughtful questions about the blacksmith's craft, Peter gradually relaxing from his initial wariness into genuine warmth toward the man who had, without any true obligation, dedicated considerable resources and effort simply to reunite two people whose only connection to him was through marriage and grief shared. On their final evening before reaching London, as Peter slept in the corner of the carriage, exhausted from the emotional weight of the preceding days, Ilara turned to Alaric with a heart so full of gratitude she could scarcely find words adequate to express it. "You gave me back the one thing I believed lost forever," she said softly, careful not to wake her sleeping brother. "I do not know how I will ever repay such a gift." "You owe me nothing," Alaric said gently, reaching for her hand across the small space between them. "Watching you reunited with your brother has been reward enough, more than enough, for whatever small effort I contributed toward making it possible. I told you once that I did not know, before you, how deeply I longed for genuine companionship. I did not know either, until this journey, how much joy could be found in simply watching someone I love receive the happiness they have deserved for so very long." Alara's breath caught at his words, at the casual, easy way he had finally spoken the word that had been growing steadily between them for weeks without either of them quite finding the courage to name it aloud. "You love me," she said softly, not quite a question, though wonder still colored her voice. "I do," Alaric said simply, his eyes steady and warm on hers in the dim light of the carriage. "I have for some time now, though I confess I did not know precisely when the feeling took root. Perhaps that first night, when I found you standing outside a locked door, curious rather than afraid, unwilling to simply accept mystery without at least attempting to understand it. I think some part of me knew, even then, that you were someone entirely worth loving." "I love you as well," Ilara whispered, leaning across the small space to rest her forehead gently against his. "I did not expect to find such happiness in a marriage born of debt and duty, yet here I am, more content than I ever believed possible, with both my husband and my brother beside me." The carriage rolled steadily onward through the darkening countryside, carrying them home toward a future neither had anticipated when their marriage was first arranged, a future filled now not with cold obligation, but with genuine love, restored family, and the quiet, steady happiness of two people who had each spent too many years believing themselves destined for loneliness, only to discover, unexpectedly, that they had found in each other exactly what they had both been searching for all along. When they finally arrived at Marchfield House, the household staff gathered once more in the entrance hall, though the atmosphere this time held none of the cool, cautious formality that had greeted Ilara on her very first day. Mrs. Prescott stepped forward immediately, her sharp features softened by unmistakable warmth, to welcome Peter with a curtsy far deeper than the brief one she had once offered Ilara. "Welcome home, young master," she said, and the words, so simple, seemed to strike Peter with unexpected force, his eyes glistening as he glanced around the grand entrance hall that would now, impossibly, be counted among his family's homes. Nora hurried forward as well, unable to contain her excitement at the household's good fortune, offering Peter a bright, welcoming smile even as she cast an affectionate glance toward Ilara. "I am so glad, my lady," she whispered, squeezing Ilara's hand briefly before returning to her duties. "So very glad for you both." Alaric personally showed Peter to a set of rooms on the second floor, spacious and comfortable, though Peter protested more than once that such grandeur felt entirely unnecessary for a blacksmith's apprentice unaccustomed to fine living. "You are family now," Alaric told him firmly, brooking no argument. "There is no need for you to feel unworthy of comfort within these walls." This house has stood empty of proper family warmth for too many years already. It is past time that changed. That evening, the three of them dined together in the grand dining room that had once felt so vast and lonely to Alara during her earliest days of marriage. Now, filled with laughter and easy conversation, the space finally felt as it should, warm and alive rather than cold and echoing. Peter recounted stories from his years at the forge with growing ease, and Alaric listened with genuine interest, occasionally sharing observations of his own about horses and metalwork, drawn from his years managing the Marchfield estate. Alara watched the two men who had come to matter most in her life grow steadily more comfortable in each other's company, and felt something settle deep within her chest, a peace she had not known she was capable of feeling after so many years of grief and uncertainty. The locked doors of her past, both literal and otherwise, had finally begun opening one by one, revealing not further sorrow, but the steady, patient unfolding of a happiness she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. Later that night, after Peter had retired to his new chambers, exhausted but undeniably content, Alara and Alaric walked together through the moonlit garden, the same garden where he had first confessed the depth of his feelings for her, only days before. "I keep expecting to wake and discover this was all some elaborate dream," Alara admitted softly, gazing up at the stars scattered across the clear night sky. "A husband who loves me, a brother restored to my life after a decade of silence. It feels almost too much happiness for one lifetime to hold." "Then let us simply enjoy it," Alaric said, drawing her close against his side, "without questioning whether we deserve it, without waiting anxiously for it to be taken away. We have both spent enough years guarding ourselves against disappointment. I think it is time we allowed ourselves, fully and without reservation, to be happy." Alara turned into his embrace, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear. "Happy," she repeated softly, testing the word, finding it fit more naturally than she ever could have imagined on that first, frightened carriage ride toward a marriage she had believed would bring only cold duty and quiet suffering. Instead, it had brought her everything she had once thought lost forever: a husband who cherished her, a brother restored to her arms, and a home finally filled with the warmth and laughter it had been missing for far too long. Snow fell softly over the gardens of Marchfield House on the morning Alara woke to the sound of laughter echoing through the corridors, a sound so unfamiliar to the great house not so very long ago that she still felt a small thrill of wonder each time she heard it. 6 months had passed since Peter's return, and the household had transformed almost beyond recognition in that time. What had once been a place of careful silence and guarded formality now buzzed with warmth and easy conversation, the servants moving through their duties with genuine contentment, rather than the wary caution Alara remembered from her earliest days as the new Duchess. Peter had settled into life at Marchfield with a grace that had surprised even Alara, who had worried, in quiet moments, that the sudden shift from a blacksmith's humble forge to the grandeur of a duke's household might prove too difficult an adjustment. Instead, her brother had approached his new circumstances with the same steady, practical determination that had carried him through a decade of hardship, applying himself diligently to the education Alaric had arranged for him, while also, at his own insistence, continuing to work several mornings each week in a small forge Alaric had commissioned to be built on the estate grounds. "I cannot simply abandon a craft that gave me purpose all those years," Peter had explained, when Alaric first offered to release him entirely from such labor. "Besides, there is an honest satisfaction in working with one's hands that I do not believe I could easily give up, however grand my new circumstances have become." Alaric had respected the wish without hesitation, and the small estate forge had become something of a gathering place in the months since, tenant farmers bringing their tools for repair, stable hands seeking Peter's growing expertise with horseshoes and ironwork, the entire estate benefiting from the quiet dignity of labor that Peter had refused to abandon despite his elevated new circumstances. This particular morning, Alara found her brother and her husband already awake and dressed, standing together near the estate stables, examining a new horse that had arrived only the previous week, their heads bent close in easy, comfortable conversation. She paused for a moment at the window of her chambers simply to watch them, marveling still at how naturally the two men had grown into genuine affection for each other, brothers now in every sense but blood. "They have become rather inseparable, have they not?" Nora observed cheerfully, entering with a fresh pot of tea, and following Alara's gaze toward the window. "His Grace has not smiled so often in all my years serving this household, my lady, not since long before his mother's passing, if the older staff are to be believed." "I have noticed the same," Alara said, smiling as she watched Peter say something that made Alaric laugh. a full, unguarded sound that still occasionally caught her by surprise, so different from the careful, distant man who had greeted her on her wedding day nearly a year past. Christmas approached with all the warmth and preparation the household had been sorely missing in years prior. Alara found herself deeply involved in planning the season's celebrations, insisting on traditions she remembered fondly from her own childhood, simple joys like caroling among the tenant families, and a great feast shared not only among the family but extended, at Alara's gentle insistence, to include the household staff as honored guests rather than merely silent servers. "You have brought such life back into this house," Alaric told her one evening, as they sat together before the fire in the small sitting room that had become, over the months, their favorite place to retreat at day's end. "I confess I had grown so accustomed to Marchfield's quiet formality that I nearly forgot a home could feel this alive. It is not merely my doing," Alara said, resting her head against his shoulder. "You opened yourself to this happiness as much as I did. That took courage of its own, I think, for a man so long accustomed to guarding himself against disappointment." Their mother, Alara's own mother, had passed quietly the previous spring, her health never fully recovering from the years of grief and hardship following her husband's death. Though the loss had brought fresh sorrow, both Alara and Peter had found comfort in facing it together, no longer isolated in their individual griefs as they had been throughout the long years of separation. Alaric had stood steadily beside them both throughout the difficult weeks that followed, arranging a peaceful, dignified service, and quietly ensuring that whatever modest debts remained from their family's earlier hardship were settled without either sibling needing to carry that particular burden any further. "She would be glad," Peter had said at the graveside, taking his sister's hand, "to know we found our way back to each other in the end, whatever hardship came before it." Alara had agreed, finding a strange, gentle peace in the certainty that whatever grief her mother had carried through her final years, she had at least passed knowing her children were reunited and cared for, a small mercy amid the larger sorrow of her passing. Now, as winter settled fully over the estate and the household prepared for its first truly joyful Christmas in longer than anyone could easily remember, Alara found herself standing once more in the small nursery at the end of the upstairs corridor, the room Alaric had shown her so many months before, filled with the quiet evidence of his own childhood cut short by loss. The room looked different now. Fresh linens had replaced the faded, dusty ones, sunlight filtering through windows that had been cleaned and opened regularly rather than sealed away behind a locked door. Alaric found her there one afternoon, standing quietly amid the gentle transformation the room had undergone in recent weeks. "I thought perhaps," she said when he asked what had brought her there, "that a room meant for a child's laughter should not remain empty forever." Understanding dawned slowly across Alaric's face, followed by an expression of such open, hopeful joy that Alara felt her own heart swell with matching happiness. "Alara," he said softly, "are you telling me?" "I am," she confirmed, watching tears gather unexpectedly in her husband's eyes. This man the whole of London still occasionally whispered about as cold and unfeeling, undone entirely by the news of a child yet to be born. By summer's end, God willing, this house will finally have the laughter it has been missing for far too long. Alaric crossed the small room and gathered her gently into his arms, careful and reverent, as though she had become something infinitely precious in the space of a single heartbeat, though in truth, she realized, he had likely felt this way about her for quite some time already. "I love you," he whispered against her hair, "more than I believed myself capable of loving anyone, and now you have given me a gift I scarcely dared to hope for." "We gave it to each other," Alara said softly, echoing words she had spoken to him once before, in a moment that felt both distant and impossibly close, the moment they had first faced Edmund's cruelty together, and discovered, in doing so, the true strength of the partnership they had built. Peter, when told the news that evening, let out a whoop of joy so unrestrained that even Mrs. Prescott, standing nearby with a tray of refreshments, could not help but laugh at the young man's open, unguarded delight. "An uncle," he said, shaking his head with wonder. "I never imagined such happiness could follow so much hardship." "Neither did I," Alara admitted, looking between the two men who had come to mean everything to her, her husband and her brother, both restored to her life through circumstances she could never have predicted on that cold, frightened morning, when she had first stepped into a carriage bound for a marriage she believed would bring only suffering. Instead, it had brought her home, in every sense that mattered, a husband whose love had proven as steady and enduring as the title he carried, a brother returned after a decade of painful separation, his laughter once more filling halls that had known too much silence. And now, a child yet to come, a new generation that would grow up within walls no longer weighted by grief and guarded secrets, but filled instead with warmth, honesty, and the kind of genuine, hard-won happiness that neither Alara nor Alaric had ever truly believed themselves capable of finding. Word of Alara's condition spread quickly through the household in the days that followed, met everywhere with genuine warmth and celebration. Mrs. Prescott took it upon herself to oversee preparations for the nursery, with the same meticulous care she applied to every aspect of running the estate, though Alara noticed the older woman's usual brisk efficiency softened, on more than one occasion, by an unmistakable fondness whenever she paused to discuss the coming arrival. "I have served this family many years, my lady," Mrs. Prescott confided one afternoon, as they reviewed fabric samples for the nursery's new curtains. "I never thought I would see such joy return to these halls, not after the mistress passed when his grace was still a boy himself. It does my heart good, more than I can properly express, to see this house filled with such promise again." Nora, for her part, could barely contain her excitement, chattering happily about the coming months as she attended to Alara's morning routine, already speculating whether the child might favor its father's dark hair or its mother's softer features, whether it might inherit Peter's steady hands or Alaric's quiet thoughtfulness. Alara found herself laughing more freely than she had in years at the maid's endless, good-natured speculation, grateful for the genuine affection that had grown between them since that first nervous morning so long ago. Edmund, notably, had not been seen in London society for several months, word eventually reaching Marchfield that he had retreated to a distant property to manage his considerably reduced circumstances following the exposure of his debts. Alaric mentioned it only briefly, without malice, expressing a quiet hope that his cousin might yet find some path toward honest, settled contentment, however unlikely that outcome seemed given Edmund's past behavior. Alara found she could not summon much anger toward the man any longer, her heart too full of present happiness to spare much room for old resentments. As the weeks passed and winter deepened, Peter took to spending quiet evenings in the growing nursery alongside Alara and Alaric, offering his own steady, practical opinions on cradles and furnishings, occasionally disappearing into his estate forge to craft small, careful ironwork pieces meant for the child's room. Tiny decorative touches fashioned with the same patient skill that had once been his only trade and refuge. Alara treasured each small gift, understanding the depth of love behind every carefully hammered piece, a language of devotion her brother had learned to speak through his hands long before he had ever learned to speak freely of his feelings again. One quiet evening near the year's end, the three of them gathered in the sitting room as snow continued falling steadily outside, Peter reading aloud from a favorite childhood story, while Alara rested against Alaric's shoulder, her hand resting gently over the small, still barely noticeable curve of her stomach. It struck her, in that peaceful moment, how completely her life had transformed from the frightened uncertainty of that first carriage ride toward Marchfield House. How thoroughly the locked doors and guarded silences of those early days had given way to warmth, honesty, and a home finally filled with the family she had once feared lost forever. "Whatever this next year brings," Alaric murmured softly, pressing a gentle kiss against her temple as Peter's voice continued reading in the background. "I find myself more grateful than I can properly express, for you, for Peter's return, for the family we are only just beginning to build together." "As am I," Alara whispered back, watching the snow drift softly past the window, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely at peace. As snow continued to fall softly outside the tall windows of Marchfield House, Alara allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to simply be happy, grateful beyond measure for a marriage that had begun in cold duty and fear, yet had somehow, through patience, honesty, and quiet courage, blossomed into the truest love she had ever known.